Eric asked to come back quietly, almost humbly, which was perhaps what made Ridge's refusal cut so deeply. It did not happen in front of the board, nor during a public confrontation that could be dismissed as performance. It happened in a narrow emotional corridor where pride and vulnerability briefly shared the same air. Eric framed his return as help, as continuity, as an easing of pressure during a moment when the company was clearly struggling to stabilize itself. But beneath the words lay something far more fragile and far more dangerous, the need to be needed. Ridge heard the request not as assistance, but as regression, as an attempt to reclaim authority through sentiment. And he shut it down with a firmness that left no space for reinterpretation. That refusal did more than wound Eric. It fractured the family's internal gravity. Ridge believed he was protecting the future, drawing a necessary boundary between legacy and leadership. He told himself that compassion could not be allowed to undermine control, that clarity required decisiveness, even when decisiveness looked like cruelty. But families do not process power the way companies do. The denial reverberated through shared history, through memories of mentorship and sacrifice that could not be cleanly separated from balance sheets and brand strategies. What Ridge saw as discipline, others felt as erasure. Donna watched the damage unfold with growing alarm. She understood Eric's pride intimately, understood how deeply his sense of self was entwined with the house he had built stitch by stitch. When she urged him to step into the holiday light, to attend events, to be seen smiling beneath decorations meant to signal continuity and warmth, she believed she was offering rescue. She believed that presence itself could soften rejection, that visibility could restore dignity. Yet every attempt to lift the mood only revealed what Eric was truly facing. He did not merely want a role. He needed proof that he still mattered at the core, that the company's heartbeat had not moved on without him. The holidays became a cruel mirror. Laughter rang louder than usual, decorations brighter, traditions carefully staged to suggest resilience. But Eric felt like a guest in a house that had once been an extension of his body. Each smile directed his way carried an undertone of accommodation rather than respect. The celebration did not heal him, it clarified his displacement. Donna saw it then, the truth she had tried to outrun. This was not about age or relevance in the abstract. It was about authorship. Eric needed to know that the story of Forester still began with him, not as a footnote, not as a ceremonial presence, but as a living source of meaning. Ridge, consumed by the weight of leadership and haunted by the collapse that had taken so much already, could not see this need without feeling threatened by it. To acknowledge Eric's centrality would be to admit that control did not equal ownership, that governance did not confer soul. Ridge had learned to survive by tightening his grip, by believing that stewardship meant command. The more the company struggled, the more he leaned into authority, mistaking firmness for stability. In doing so, he overlooked the quiet truth that legacy cannot be managed into submission. It must be honored, or it will find another way to speak. That other way emerged slowly, then all at once. Eric did not announce his next move. He did not seek permission or stage a dramatic departure. He listened, observed, and allowed rejection to crystallize into resolve. The channel, he found, was not an enemy in the traditional sense, it was an opening. A space where artistry mattered more than hierarchy, where narrative could be reframed without begging for approval. It was connected, indirectly and perhaps unavoidably, to the new currents flowing through the industry, currents that Katie's chapter had helped accelerate. This connection was not an alliance of convenience, it was a convergence of philosophy. Innovation did not have to mean abandonment. Evolution did not require amnesia. What Eric proposed was not a coup. It was a conversation conducted in fabric and form. A collection that refused nostalgia while honoring lineage, that spoke in a language Ridge could not dismiss as sentimentality. Each piece carried intention, not as rebellion, but as testimony. It reminded the industry that vision did not expire when authority changed hands. It challenged the assumption that leadership alone defined legitimacy. The response was immediate and undeniable. Critics did not frame it as a comeback, they framed it as a revelation. The impact forced a reckoning. Ridge could not ignore the resonance without undermining his own claims to stewardship. The collection did what no argument could. It demonstrated that the soul of the legacy was not contained within executive control. It lived in creative truth, in continuity that adapted rather than hardened. Ridge found himself facing a paradox: he could no longer manage away. He could run the company. He could enforce direction. But he could not own the essence that made it matter. For the family, the consequences were profound. Lines drawn in the name of efficiency blurred under the weight of recognition. Donna saw vindication not in victory, but in balance restored. Eric did not need to return through the front door to reclaim his place. He needed to be seen as indispensable without begging. The story shifted from rejection to acknowledgement, from fracture to uneasy alignment. In the end, the retaliation was not destructive. It was clarifying. It reminded everyone involved that legacy is not a trophy passed downward, but a living dialogue between past and future. Ridge learned, painfully and publicly, that authority without reverence hollows itself. Eric learned that relevance is not granted, it is asserted through truth. And the company, caught between them, confronted the lesson it had tried to avoid: that survival depends not only on who leads, but on what is remembered, protected, and allowed to evolve. The holidays ended, the lights dimmed, and the illusion of harmony gave way to something more honest. The family was changed, not because power had shifted hands, but because meaning had been reclaimed. And in that reclamation, Forester rediscovered the uncomfortable, necessary truth that its heart could not be outsourced, silenced, or replaced, only listened to. The confrontation did not erupt the way confrontations were supposed to. There was no crowd, no raised voices echoing down hallways, no carefully positioned witnesses to validate either side. It happened after hours, when the building had settled into its hollow nighttime quiet, when the company's lights were fewer, and the city outside pressed its reflections against the glass like an uninvited audience. Ridge had summoned Eric not to negotiate, but to reassert boundaries. He believed the success of Eric's collection had crossed a line, not creatively, but symbolically. It had forced a public reckoning Ridge was not ready to absorb, and he needed to reclaim control before perception hardened into verdict. Eric arrived without defiance in his posture, but with a stillness that unsettled Ridge immediately. This was not the man who had once pleaded to return, nor the patriarch softened by age and nostalgia. There was no apology in Eric's eyes now, only resolve sharpened by a long season of being dismissed. Ridge mistook that quiet for concession, and that misreading would cost him everything. They spoke at first like executives, not family. Ridge framed his objections in language of governance and risk, arguing that Eric's move, however brilliant, had destabilized the company at a moment when cohesion was critical. He accused Eric of undermining authority under the guise of artistry, of choosing spectacle over stewardship. The words were precise, disciplined, and devastating in their detachment. Ridge did not attack Eric's talent, he attacked his relevance. He made it clear that whatever soul Eric believed he embodied, it no longer superseded leadership. Forester, Ridge insisted, could not survive if legacy kept veto power over the future. Eric listened without interruption. Each sentence landed not as insult, but as confirmation of a truth he had been circling for months. Ridge was not trying to protect the company, he was trying to protect his version of ownership. What Ridge called stability, Eric recognized as erasure. And what Ridge framed as necessary cruelty, Eric felt as the final severing of identity from purpose. The rejection was no longer professional. It was existential. When Eric finally spoke, his voice carried none of the tremor Donna had tried to soothe away during the holidays. He did not defend the collection. He did not argue metrics or public response. Instead, he articulated something Ridge had never allowed himself to consider, that the company's decline was not simply financial, but spiritual. That leadership without lineage had hollowed out the brand's meaning. That Ridge's insistence on command had turned inheritance into possession, forgetting that some things could be guided but never owned. Eric did not demand control. He demanded acknowledgement. Ridge dismissed this as sentiment disguised as principle. He accused Eric of weaponizing nostalgia to regain influence, of refusing to accept that the center had shifted. In his frustration, Ridge said the words that could not be taken back, that the company no longer needed a heart if it had a head, that execution mattered more than origin, that the past was a burden the future could not afford to carry. Something in Eric fractured then, not explosively, but with a quiet finality. The room seemed to contract around him, as if the decades he had poured into the walls were pulling inward. In that moment, Eric understood that this was not a disagreement to be resolved. It was a declaration that everything he had been was now considered excess. The grief that followed was not loud, it was heavy, absolute, and terrifying in its clarity. Eric did not pull the gun in rage. That distinction would haunt everyone later. The movement was deliberate, almost reverent, as if he were crossing a threshold he had resisted for too long. The weapon did not represent power to him, it represented inevitability. He had brought it not as a threat, but as an ending he believed he could no longer postpone. Ridge's expression shifted from irritation to disbelief, then to something like comprehension, too late to matter. There was a single shot. The sound was abrupt, obscene in its finality, tearing through the office's careful quiet. Ridge fell without drama, the authority he had wielded so confidently moments before rendered meaningless by gravity and blood. The office that had witnessed so many battles of vision and control absorbed the violence in stunned silence. There was no victory in the aftermath, no sense of release. Only the irreversible weight of what had been done. Eric stood frozen, the enormity of his action crashing over him in waves. The gun slipped from his hand as the reality asserted itself without mercy. This was not reclamation. It was annihilation. In killing Ridge, Eric had not restored the soul of the legacy, he had shattered it beyond repair. The realization came with a pain so sharp it eclipsed even the horror of the act itself. He had crossed a line that artistry, intention, and grievance could never justify. The tragedy rippled outward immediately. By morning, the narrative machine would awaken, hungry and unforgiving. A father killing a son. A legacy imploding in blood rather than balance. Every argument about control, authorship, and soul would be flattened into shock. Eric would be reduced to a monster, or a symbol, Ridge to a martyr, or a cautionary tale. The complexity that led them here would be stripped away, leaving only the spectacle of violence. In the hours before dawn, the building remained still, as if holding vigil for a truth no one would want to face, that the war over legacy had consumed the very people it was meant to preserve. The confrontation that was supposed to settle ownership had ended not in resolution, but in irreversible loss. And whatever future awaited Forester now would be shaped not by design or vision, but by the echo of a single moment when grief, pride, and desperation converged into something no one could undo. Dawn did not arrive gently. It forced its way into the office through the glass walls, revealing what the night had tried to keep hidden. The city below resumed its indifferent rhythm, unaware that inside one of its most iconic buildings, the future of a dynasty had collapsed into a stillness no amount of wealth or legacy could undo. Ridge's body lay where it had fallen, authority reduced to silence, ambition extinguished without ceremony. The sketches on the walls, visions of seasons yet to come, watched without judgment, their relevance instantly rendered uncertain. Eric did not flee. That, too, would later be dissected and debated. He remained seated on the edge of the desk, hands empty, shoulders bowed under a weight far heavier than consequence. In the hours between the gunshot and the arrival of others, time stretched into something unrecognizable. Memory flooded him in fragments, Ridge as a child tracing fabrics with reverence, Ridge as a young man arguing passionately about vision, Ridge as a leader hardened by pressure and fear. None of it formed a defense. None of it softened what had happened. Eric understood, with devastating clarity, that intention no longer mattered. Meaning had been replaced by fact. When the first security guard arrived, followed by the police, the scene crystallized into procedure. Questions were asked, statements taken, evidence catalogued. The office became a crime scene, stripped of symbolism, and reduced to measurements and markers. Eric answered when spoken to, his voice distant, as if traveling from somewhere far behind his eyes. He did not deny the act. He did not explain it. There was no explanation that could survive daylight. The news broke before noon, spreading with the velocity reserved for scandal and tragedy intertwined. Headlines did not bother with nuance. They did not need to. A founder had killed his son. A fashion empire had imploded in the most public way possible. The story wrote itself, cruelly efficient, flattening decades of complexity into a single, incomprehensible act. Markets reacted immediately. Shares wavered. Partners issued statements heavy with condolences and carefully worded distance. The brand name, once synonymous with elegance and endurance, became inseparable from violence. Inside the family, the shock fractured along fault lines that had been forming for years. Brooke collapsed inward, replaying the letter in her mind with new horror. The cadence she had questioned now felt sinister in retrospect, as if everything had been moving toward this moment with a terrible inevitability. She wondered whether the warning signs had been clearer than she had allowed herself to admit, whether the language of containment and control had been rehearsals for something far darker than public relations. Donna arrived at the house as if moving through water, each step heavy with disbelief. She had tried to pull Eric toward light, toward visibility, toward life beyond rejection. Now she faced the impossible truth that love had not been enough to anchor him. The man she had known, brilliant, stubborn, deeply human, had crossed into a place she could not follow. Her grief was not clean. It was tangled with guilt, with unanswered questions, with the haunting realization that she had mistaken despair for pride. Katie watched the narrative shift, with a sickening sense of inevitability. The whispers that had once painted her as ruthlessly ambitious now sharpened into something far more dangerous. If Ridge had been pushed, if legacy had been stolen, then someone had to embody that theft. Even as public sympathy briefly recoiled from Eric in shock, it recalibrated toward a more palatable villain. Success, once celebrated, became suspect. Katie understood the pattern, because she had lived inside it before. Tragedy demanded symmetry, and if the father was the executioner, the industry would search for the force that made the execution necessary. She released a statement that afternoon, measured, restrained, refusing speculation. It did not defend her success, or condemn Eric's actions. It spoke only of loss, of the human cost behind public narratives. Critics called it evasive. Supporters called it dignified. Katie knew better than to believe either. Words, she had learned, were temporary shields at best. As investigators reconstructed the night, the truth grew heavier rather than clearer. There was no evidence of premeditation in the legal sense that would simplify the case. No manifesto. No plan beyond the gun itself, which Eric had owned legally for years. The confrontation, the argument, the fatal moment, everything pointed to an emotional implosion rather than a calculated crime. That distinction mattered in courtrooms, but not in the court of public opinion. Their intent was irrelevant. Outcome was king. The trial that followed became less about guilt, which Eric did not contest, and more about meaning. Lawyers spoke of mental collapse, of identity erosion, of the psychological toll of being erased from one's life's work. Prosecutors spoke of responsibility, of choice, of the line that must never be crossed regardless of pain. Each argument carved away at the family's private grief, turning it into material for consumption. The audience did not want understanding, it wanted resolution. Forester itself entered a state of suspended animation. Interim leadership was appointed, strategies frozen, launches delayed. Employees moved through halls heavy with uncertainty, unsure whether they were preserving a legacy or prolonging a ghost. The question no one could answer was deceptively simple: what did Forester stand for now? The soul Eric had fought to assert was stained beyond reclamation, yet the authority Ridge had enforced lay buried with him. The company existed, but its meaning was contested territory. In quiet moments, Brooke returned to the letter again and again. She noticed now not only the cadence, but the omissions. The way it spoke of responsibility, without naming love, of release without forgiveness. She began to wonder whether Ridge had sensed the danger Eric was in, whether the letter had been an attempt, conscious or not, to create an ending that removed pressure rather than resolving it. That possibility did not absolve anyone. It only deepened the tragedy. Eric, confined and isolated, finally allowed himself to feel what he had refused to face before the shot. Not triumph. Not vindication. Only absence. The legacy he believed he was defending had dissolved in his hands, leaving behind nothing but the certainty that some losses cannot be argued away. In the stillness of confinement, stripped of influence and audience, he confronted the truth he had avoided, that being the heart of something does not grant the right to decide how it beats. Months later, as seasons changed and the noise softened into a dull ache, the family stood at a crossroads without a map. Reconciliation felt impossible. Forgetting felt obscene. Moving forward required redefining forward itself. Katie continued to build, not as defiance, but as survival. Donna learned to live with a love that could not save. Brooke carried the burden of knowing that insight, without action, is its own kind of failure. The story did not end with a verdict or a sentence. It lingered, unresolved, in boardrooms and ateliers, in conversations that stopped mid-sentence, in designs that hesitated between homage and escape. Ridge's absence remained a question no one could answer cleanly. Eric's act remained a wound that refused closure. And Forester, once a symbol of continuity, became a cautionary tale, not about ambition or rebellion alone, but about what happens when identity is mistaken for ownership, when love is filtered through control, and when the fight for a legacy forgets the people it was meant to honor.